problem, why this happened was, like I said, we were colonists. Other people were colonists too. And the real problem is that most of our historical records are either in Sanskrit or in regional languages. Let's look at this in a little more detail. Most available English translations of these primary sources of history are at best second rate, or at worst they are misleading. And I don't know how to say this, but anyway, so our emphasis on getting our kids educated only in the English medium has only perpetuated this distortion, this Eurocentric approach to university, right? And well, our education boards are also controlled by those who peddle the same Eurocentric / and or Marxist version, and so it's like a vicious cycle, it keeps continuing. But despite that, the fact that we are still having this discussion proves what a tough nut university has been to crack. Otherwise, we'd all be, happily sitting and reading that same biased version and saying, okay, this is what India's history is. The fact that we are having this discussion shows, there's some substance there. Some points to consider here. Now, Alexander was or is regarded as a world conqueror, if not the greatest conqueror ever in historical times. But what is his record in India? Even today, his biggest success in India is his defeat of Porus or Silver, right? Look at this. World conqueror comes to India, defeats only one king who ruled over not a very large extent of it.
Maybe 10%.
Yeah. And that is held as his biggest success in India. And what was his extent of actual territorial conquest in India? It was pretty meager. He couldn't even touch the motherland. Yes?
Actually, is not into Indian province,
yes,
as has the
yes,
textbooks been telling us.
Yeah. Now, if that is on one side, how do Indians remember what is our memory? How do Indians remember Alexander's conquest? It is it's equivalent of an ant bite. The most destructive invasions that happened were the Muslim invasions. Until then, they were either absorbed into Indian mainstream or they were thwarted and sent back. So, it's not an exaggeration to say that Alexander's conquest is all but a forgotten chapter as far as India is concerned. Now, look at this other point. When the British came to India, what did they come as? They came as just traders, and they brought in a lot of booty, supplicated before Jahangir, supplicated before various kings, please let us trade. They were in a weaker position, just please let us trade. And within just 2 centuries, they suddenly realized that overnight they had become a master race who were meant to rule the earth. How did this transformation happen? And what does that tell you? And they began writing history from that perspective. Now, some predictable consequences of continuing to adopt this Eurocentric history writing. It has perpetuated the colonial project of instilling a sense of inferiority among Indians about their own cultural heritage. Now, the unstated but underlying assumption is that India needs to examine its own past through Western lenses. I'm repeating myself. Now, I'm repeating myself because this has 2 important bearings. One is it meant following theories like the Aryan migration theory, Aryan invasion theory. Now, the logical end of the Aryan invasion theory, if you accept it, it means that Indian history was a series of alien invasions and that Indians as a people had no original accomplishments whatsoever. It also meant that India was never a united country, but a loose conglomeration of perpetually warring races, Aryans versus Dravidians, kings versus other kings, region versus other regions, communities versus other communities. Yeah, something. So, when you talk about Indian history from this perspective, you must only talk about the parts and not the whole. Once you accept this theory, the Aryan invasion theory, and all the other bastard theories that arise from that, you must necessarily talk about India in parts and not India as a united whole. But then look what happens when you encounter the history of medieval Islamic period, right? What happens to this theory? The whole 800 odd years of wrong Muslim rule is suddenly painted as an effort to unite India. Whatever happens to the perpetually warring factions then, that somehow suddenly disappears. Okay, but you come to the British period. After the Muslims disintegrated, you come to the British period. What happens to this system? The same narrative changes in a different way. It is portrayed as if the British were imperialists who enslaved India for colonial purposes. They might have enslaved, but they still united India, like the Muslims. But why is that perspective missing here? And I don't need to specifically say that with Nehru's patronage, this kind of theories were not only pushed aggressively, but history became a handmade. It was perverted to include ideological support for communism, more specifically to USSR. Now, Arun Shourie sums up all these consequences pretty well. What it has led to currently, the state of this kind of perversion. Seldom has a society been in as confused a condition as it is today. India itself has been called into question. Every other objective has been exalted so much to be at par with every other objective. The human rights of the terrorist is supposed to be at par with the survival of the country. Now, let's look at some broad hints or guidelines or a plea for a new perspective. So, from this pretty long discussion, how do you? So, it's pretty obvious that the first thing we need to alter is the way we approach the study of Indian history. This is not a call, or it's not to advocate against scientific methods used to study history, because you can't falsify some of these methods. Arguing against them is like saying 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is false. So you can't do that. It is not so much the method, but the approach or the outlook that needs to be changed. Now, this approach is one that history writers of every nation follow. You look at the way history is taught in America. It is with liberal doses of patriotism. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Depends who you read. Read Howard Zinn's people.
No, in the school books.
Oh, absolutely. Very patriotic.
Yes. Pilgrim Fathers. So that patriotism is implicit. Now, in India it is disparagingly called the nationalistic approach. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong about telling the history of your country as your own countrymen saw it in the past or in the present, and how they lived it and how they recorded it. To do this, we need to, ransack all the primary sources written by us, written by Indians, and natives, if you will, in all languages. than rely on the interpretation of these primary sources by foreigners who wrote history. Because if you look at most of Europeans who wrote Indian history, it was their interpretation. It was not a fact. In so many cases, they have interpreted something to mean the exact opposite of what it actually means. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now, let's take the example of travelers' accounts. You have people like Al-Biruni, Niccolo Conte, Abdul Razak, Hyun San, Eat Singh, Ibn Battuta. These guys, if you look at their travelogues, their accounts, in so many cases, especially when it comes to local customs, traditions, cultures, etc., they have given a completely misleading account. Because most of the Muslim travelers who came in here viewed Indians as idolaters. So they kind of force-fitted, or they said, okay, I don't understand this, so let me abuse it. So you can find this liberally, especially with this guy Niccolo Conte, who gives an elaborate picture of a supposed rebellion that broke out in Krishnadevaraya's time, where some 20 soldiers stabbed Krishnadevara, apparently stabbed him, which is, there's no mention of that in Krishnadevaraya's contemporary accounts by natives. Now think about this. You go to a foreign country as a traveler. You have no knowledge of it. We are talking about that period. You've just heard that India is like this, or the US is like that. Now you have the net and all that, but you're talking about not today's world. You go there and you look at the customs tradition. You have no background, no knowledge at all. You not live there. You don't know why something is done the way it is done. But you stay there for, say, 5-6 years and you write a travelogue, and obviously these things will also come there. And you leave that behind and go back. How accurate will your picture be? Will your understanding of that be? Now you leave behind, say, your travelogue in, say, US, and those guys write a history of the US later. What are the chances that they won't take these things with pinch of? But what have we done? We rely more on, say, Eat Singh, for example. He writes that Bhartrhari converted from Hinduism to Buddhism, Buddhism to Hinduism, Buddhism to Hinduism to Hinduism to Hinduism 7 times, which is absolute crap. Excuse the language. Out here, traditionally, even today, conversion is not something that we take lightly, that traditional Hindus take lightly. It has to come from within, so to say. Constraints of time won't permit me to elaborate on that. But this thing, Eat Singh's word is supposedly held as an authentic, if not authoritative proof when you trace the life sketch of it. What does that tell you about the historians who write this way? Now look at some specialities of India. Some natural some facts of nature. There is a near even distribution of sunlight almost across India throughout the year. Right? No country is as fortunate as India of receiving a healthy dose of sunlight. Okay, that's very important. We'll come to that in a minute. And a guaranteed rainfall, a guaranteed monsoon, so to say. And in all the periods historically where rains have failed, famine has occurred. Right? And people have died. But you had a pretty much guaranteed monsoon. Okay? Now, indeed, the word Varsha is the only word in pretty much all of world languages which means both space and time. Because Varsha also means time as in Varsha Kala, that is rainfall, season of rain, and space as in Bharatvarsha, geographical location. And you look at India's geography and natural resources, it's pretty much conducive for its hospitality, right? For people to settle, for prolonged periods of time, for cultures to flourish. And the reason I'm saying all this is because every civilization is also shaped by its geography and its climate. Now, most of European countries, the Arabian region, and why even China, historically had to fight with not other people, but they had to fight against the forces of nature. Because in most of Europe, the weather is very harsh, right? And look at geography of China, it's a very hard geography, right? So most of the people who lived there, their real effort was survival, surviving the climate, surviving the geography. And you don't know where your next meal comes from, how you can be safe against the forces of nature. Let's also look at the kind of natural resources these countries have. Not pretty much, right? So what did they do? They went out and conquered. When you have something in abundance in your own house, in your own surroundings, you won't go up and fall upon your neighbor or somebody else who has more. Right? It was a question of survival, so to say. So, I mean, you look at the so-called primitive civilization, look at their brutalities. Most of these early civilizations, or races and tribes, if you will, were the Huns, the Scythians, and the Vandals, and the Visigoths, and Mongols. They were all extremely brutal guys. You fall upon a place, you ransack it, burn it. It is, this kind of nature is shaped by the climate and the geography they live in. Partly. And this is also one of the important reasons why Indians can get out of India and conquer the lands. You had everything. The Indo-Gangetic plain was conducive for settlement. You had abundant water supply, fertile lands, good flora, fauna, and see how the same geography has shaped Indian civilization and history and culture. So because once within Croatia you had one family, you would normally devise a way to store water, right? So you will anticipate that okay, something like famine will happen. So let's do something with it. Save water. So you had some of the most elaborate irrigation systems out here, which continued till date, till at least even the 19th century, mid-19th century. And again, thanks to the kind of variety of flora and fauna that we had, we developed perhaps the most elaborate system of medicine, Ayurveda, which was pretty much in vogue for several centuries. And the kind of foodstuff that we have. And you look at culinary diversity. Perhaps no other country has prepares this many varieties of delicacies and this obviously also shapes the life and lifestyle of Indians, which were mostly sedentary, more sedate, and the whole meditative culture. That happens when you have enough time for leisure, right? You settle down and you develop political and economic stability, you are prosperous, and then you think at other things, you look at other things. So which is how we were able to evolve a primarily a meditative system of philosophy. Now, one other point is what we haven't done, and what accepting or swallowing the Eurocentric version of Indian history uncritically. What that has prevented is that it has prevented us from doing the comparative analysis of India's history with the history of other nations or other civilizations. How do Indians view the authentic history of other nations compared to our own history? right? This we have done, and I think it is one of the urgent needs that we face now. And to do that, I mean, we come back to the same point. We need to first reclaim India's authentic history. Now, a few points on this comparative analysis. Now, check out the size of India, like I mentioned, and check out its diversity, not just in geography or resources, etc., the regions. Check out so many differences and diversity within the people itself of different regions. I mean, you go from, say, Karnataka to next door Tamil Nadu. There's a huge difference in terms of people, right? But you don't feel like you're stepping into another country. This is not true. You can't say this, say the same, with respect to, say, England and France. And this unity was possible, but you don't feel that you're outside India. I mean, one anecdote comes to mind. Some Kumbh Mela happened during Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya's time, and there was an English gentleman who looked at the crowd and he was like, I mean, this is enormous, and I've never seen something like this. How do you manage to get so many people in one place? I mean, what is the means of, how do you communicate, and where do you announce? So, Pandit Malviya, he just, not uncommon. So he just took out the Panchanga, the almanac, Hindu calendar, and he said, this is the only announcement. So what does that tell you about the cultural unity of India? Right? And this unity wasn't possible even in Europe, which was united, so to say, united under the banner of Christianity. You still find it. And also consider the fact that at least until the Renaissance, all knowledge, so to say, secular knowledge, used to go from India to the Western Hemisphere through the Alps. Also consider another fact that till the mid-19th century at least, India had the largest share in world trade. Also consider one more thing, that India exported essential commodities and imported luxuries like perfumes, carpets. And I think I've come to the end of this discussion. I don't want to give out the regular things about whoever commits past mistakes is condemned to repeat them in the future, etc., etc. But one thing is that perhaps this is the only country that has been subject to a kind of repeated large-scale destruction of every imaginable sort in the whole world, but it is still nearly intact. And what does that tell us? So you want to call this study a nationalistic perspective, a nationalistic approach, a patriotic approach, and call it what you will, but you definitely need to move away from how Indian history is being currently written. And I just quote S.L. Bayappa before ending this. This is important because you cannot build a strong nation on the foundation of